What's up everyone, welcome back to my channel for another true crime video. In today's video we will be covering the case of the Monster of Tholeni. This is another South African serial killer and serial rapist. You will notice that a lot of the cases I cover, the serial killers are oftentimes also serial rapists. That is mainly because South Africa's first profiler, Mickey Pistorius, specifically included sexual motivation as a criterion in order to be considered a serial killer. Obviously, we've already seen before that this is not always the case, like with Pierre Basson, but Pierre Basson was active long before Mickey Pistorius started her career. Law enforcement today still look for sexual aspects in the commission of serial murders before they officially label them as such. I do want to remind you that by making this video, I mean absolutely no disrespect to any of the victims or families affected by this case. This video is purely for educational purposes and to give the audience more information about the case. Like I said, today's case is covering the Monster of Tholeni, whose real name is Bulelani Mabhayi. Today's video is going to take on a little bit of a different format. Usually how I do these videos is in a retelling fashion. I'm still going to do that in the first half of the video, and then once I'm done with the retelling and everything, I will give a commentary at the end of the video with a little bit of extra information about the case, about the people involved in the case as well. Bulelani Mabhayi was born in 1974 in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa. As many of you know, South Africa has 11 official languages and 9 provinces. Each province has a dominant language, and in the Eastern Cape that language is Xhosa. The Eastern Cape is the poorest province in South Africa. Despite having large harbours, 3 airports and a very well developed railroad system, they only contributed 7.1% to the country's GDP in 2013. Being a poor community, I'm sure you can understand how this would affect the investigation, how this would affect the way the community was looked at. A little bit of history on Mabhayi. When he was 12 years old, his mother passed away, and just a year later, his father also passed. In his late teens, early 20s, he was arrested and served a 3-year jail term in Pollsmoor prison for possession and distribution of marijuana. In my opinion, compared to the sentences that a lot of other people get for marijuana, I think 3 years is on the fair side of reasonable. I have a lot of opinions about people being jailed for marijuana and things like that, so I won't get into it in this video, but maybe we'll have a discussion point sometime in the future about the legalization of this drug. His family problems did not end with the passing of his parents, however, and it turns out that he wasn't even the only killer in his immediate family. His older brother, Siyabonga Mabhayi, was sentenced to life imprisonment for a murder that he had committed. I'm not sure when exactly his brother died, if it was before or after the commencement of his sentence, but his brother did later pass away. In March of 2012, his 33-year-old cousin Mqwalaseli Mabhayi, who was also from Tholeni, was sentenced to 2 life imprisonment terms. On the 22nd of February 2009, Mqwalaseli brutally murdered 70-year-old Ntombozi Gubeva and her 12-year-old granddaughter Nonelwa. He also got an additional 10 years for housebreaking. When he was being sentenced, Mabhayi was yet to be linked to the murders that were happening in the village at this time. Mabhayi was the longest active serial killer we've covered thus far, committing his crimes from May of 2007 all the way up to August of 2012. Being active in rural Eastern Cape, his killing ground was under-resourced and underfunded. His victims were incredibly poor, and he specifically chose victims in woman-headed households. Obviously not to be caught, but also because single older women were easy targets that could be subdued and overpowered. All of these factors together were most likely why he was, for lack of a better word, so successful in his crimes. Mabhayi didn't have a lot of friends, and his neighbors referred to him as Zayedwa, which translates to he who eats alone. This is clearly in reference to him being a loner, to him always being by himself and not having strong ties in the community. Even though he lived and worked around this community, didn't have a lot of friends there, he wasn't married, so he didn't have strong ties to the community. He worked as a handyman in the area and a builder, so he worked in people's homes, and a lot of his victims knew him because he had worked in their homes. I think he was an outcast in his village, and I also think that plays to his choice in victim. He was, when he started committing these crimes, he was a 33-year-old single man in rural Eastern Cape. Generally by this time it would be expected that you have a wife, you have children, you have a family, and that was not the case for him. He was always by himself. He never had much luck with women, he never had much luck with people in general, and I think him losing his family so young, and he lost pretty much his whole family at this time, I think that's also what deterred him from forming connections with other people, it deterred him from forming relationships with other people. I don't want to excuse his actions, but I think it was a fear of attachment on his part. I'm not a psychologist, so this is only speculation from my part. Like I keep on saying, Tholeni is a very poor area. Because of where it is situated, there aren't a lot of jobs in the area, and it is a pretty barren landscape. But despite this, some people do still keep livestock. They keep things like sheep and, you know, the general cattle and goats and chickens as well. But those that are fortunate enough to find employment often work odd jobs in the village or in the nearby town of Butterworth. In terms of infrastructure, there are a lot of towns and especially villages in the Eastern Cape that have been severely neglected. In the village of Tholeni, there are a lot of abandoned and dilapidated buildings scattered between brightly colored houses. Many of these abandoned buildings, abandoned houses, actually belonged to Mabhayi's victims or their relatives who feared that they might be next in his reign of terror. His youngest victim was just 14 months old, and his oldest, and in fact first victim, was 79-year-old no-finish Eslina Mayegiso. She was killed in May of 2007. The night before her murder, Mayegiso and Mabhayi allegedly got into an altercation which ended when she chased him off her property with an axe. The following day, he returned to her property in the middle of the night, armed with an axe. He broke into her house and he bludgeoned her to death. In January of 2008, he murdered Ncediswa Zintle and Lazola Mafiga. Ncediswa and Zintle were the only adults in the house, and Lazola was the child that was murdered in this attack. In May of that same year, he broke into the Mnyelwa residence and he killed the elderly Nomandla. He raped and killed her 13-year-old daughter Liema, and then he turned the axe on her 15-month-old grandson Lukhanyo. Noxolo Mnyelwa was the mother of the baby boy and the older sister of Liema.
Mnyelwa was sleeping at a friend's house that fateful night. Her uncle, Fundisile, made the gruesome discovery the next morning. She wakes up every night at midnight, Mabhayi's preferred time to attack.
In January 2009, he killed Nokwezi Nogaya and her young daughter Sipukolo. So I know he is categorized as a serial killer, but I think that his crimes are more akin to, and this word doesn't exist, but a serial massacrist, so someone who repeatedly commits massacres, because that's exactly what he did. He literally massacred entire families in a single night, every single time. And despite this rare and very unusual crime of families being massacred, it took quite a while for not only him to be linked to the crimes, but the crimes to be linked to each other. In 2010, the police had not yet confirmed that they were in fact looking for a serial killer, but in April of that year, a task force was set up to specifically work on these cases and to apprehend the perpetrator or the perpetrators. They hired a psychologist who was also part of this task force, and they started putting together some suspect profiles. They deduced that the person that they were looking for was a black man, someone either from the community or familiar with the people in the village, and whose presence obviously wouldn't be suspicious. This person would be over the age of 16 and probably had a previous conviction for rape. Because most of the victims had been raped, there was a substantial amount of DNA evidence available to the police. On the 17th of May 2010, the task force set up a DNA and fingerprint collection project at a local church in Tholeni. And they started collecting DNA and fingerprint samples from all the men in the community that were over the age of 16. When police were collecting DNA samples, they were collecting from men that closely matched the profile. So that was black men over the age of 16 that lived in or around the area. And they also prioritized the collection of those that had previous rape convictions. I have no idea why their DNA was not already in the system. I actually don't even think we have a national database of fingerprints and DNA for convicted criminals, especially convicted violent criminals or people that have committed sexually related crimes. I don't think that we have that. We don't even have, like, I know that in America they've got a sexual offenders register. Do we have that? No, we do not. And I think after September 2019, this is something that should have been prioritized over and above any other GBV campaigns that were put forward to the government. I think it's really important that we have this database of DNA and of fingerprints, because oftentimes the people that commit these murders are repeat offenders. I'm sure that you've seen that in a lot of the cases that I covered, the people that, it was Moses Sithole specifically, as well as the last person I did, who was, I'll link it up above, but I can't remember the name right now. They all had prior convictions for something. So it's very strange to me that their information wouldn't already be on a database. Mabhayi himself spent 3 years in prison, but somehow the police still didn't have his DNA or his fingerprints. That's something that's very strange to me. I feel like I'm rambling, so let's get back to the case. So like I said, they set up a DNA and fingerprint collection project at a local church, and it was voluntary. You weren't forced to give your DNA, you weren't forced to come and be recorded. Obviously, if you don't come, you're going to be more suspicious, but it wasn't a compulsory thing. It was optional for you to do that. Mabhayi was one of the men that went to the church to have his DNA and fingerprints recorded. So when he got to the church, they collected his saliva, because that's where they were getting the DNA from. They were taking saliva samples. So they took a sample of his saliva, but they didn't take his fingerprints. And the reason that they didn't take his fingerprints is because he didn't have his identity document with him on that day. So they only took his saliva and didn't take his fingerprints. But the police have his DNA, so at the very least they can link him to the rapes of the victims. But they did not test the DNA. Since his DNA sample wasn't accompanied by a set of fingerprints, they just put it to the side and they pretty much forgot about it. He killed another family less than a month later. It was the murder of Snazombeki and her 2 grandchildren that would finally be the beginning of the end for Mabhayi. So this murder that occurred in June of 2010 was the murder that linked all the others together and confirmed the pattern that they had long suspected. So like I said, it was the beginning of the end for him. Finally, they had his DNA, they had the DNA from the crime scene, a task force had been set up, They knew what suspect they were looking for. They knew that he lived in the area. They knew so much about the suspect because they had a profile on him. So surely they would be so close to catching him. They were so close to catch him, and it was only a matter of time before they did so. I don't understand why it took basically 4 massacres with 11 victims for police to put 2 and 2 together and realize that the person or people that were breaking into houses in the middle of the night, specifically woman-headed houses, and that were killing every single person in that house with either an axe or a bush knife, was probably the same person. I don't understand why it took them so long, over 2 years, to figure out that these crimes were most likely committed by the same person. I feel like after the second set of murders, where the same weapons are used, where the circumstances are almost identical, it's not really a stretch to assume that this is someone who is developing a pattern. It's not a stretch to assume that this is someone who has probably done this before and is going to repeat it again. In my view, it's not a stretch, but I guess there's like a procedure that police have to follow before they start linking crimes together. That's the only reasonable explanation I can give as to why it took them so long. It took them so long to figure out that these crimes were connected. But these murders were committed some months apart, specifically the mass killings. Like the first mass killing I think was committed in May of 2007, and then the next one was not until January of 2008. So I think maybe that's why these murders were committed some months apart. So I will give law enforcement the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they just forgot that families of mainly women were being murdered en masse in a 12-month period. Maybe it just slipped their mind. Quick recap. Women and children are being murdered in their homes in the middle of the night since about 2007, 2008. In April of 2010, a task force is set up to help hasten the capture of the perpetrator or perpetrators. May of 2010, a DNA and fingerprint collection project is started where DNA samples are collected from men in the community of Tholeni, including the DNA of the person who we know to be responsible for these crimes, Bulelani Mabhayi. June of that same year, so just a month after his DNA is collected, he goes on to kill another family. A grandmother and her 2 grandchildren are murdered in their home. It would take another 2 years and 9 murders before Mabhayi was finally apprehended. I couldn't find a lot of information about who these victims were. I actually couldn't find who the victims were at all except for the last victim. And I also couldn't find any information about when exactly they were murdered, unfortunately. For such a small and rural village, the task force was granted some pretty good resources, and they had a lot to work with as well. They had experts in criminology, they had the psychologists, and of course the pathologists as well. They had field veterans, the help of the community, DNA evidence from the crime scene evidence, DNA samples from men in the community. They had pretty much anything that they would need. At this point, they had all the pieces of the puzzle. All that was left was for them to put it all together and finally catch this killer, finally catch the person responsible for these crimes. So you would think that with everything that I've just mentioned, all of the resources, all of the manpower, everything that they had to their disposal, that they would be able to catch this person. And you would be very, very wrong to think that. They didn't catch him because of exemplary police work. That would be a South African first, especially in rural Eastern Cape where the victims are poor black women. They caught him purely because of dumb luck. On the 11th of August 2012, Mabhayi claimed his last victim, 57-year-old Nophumzile Florence Lubambo. On the night of the attack, sometime during the attack, one of his shoes came off in the struggle, and for some reason he just left his shoe there. So when police came to investigate the crime scene and to start collecting evidence, they found this shoe. They started asking around in the community if they knew anyone who wore the shoe, because it was a very specific type of shoe. Like I mentioned, there weren't a lot of jobs in the area, but this shoe was a workman's boot, so it wasn't a common shoe that people would have around the town. So they started asking around in the village if people had seen this shoe before, if they knew someone who owned a similar pair of shoes, and That's how they found out that Mabhayi owned a pair just like this. Like I said before, he was a builder, and this was a construction shoe, a heavy duty boot. I'm explaining this boot too much. Let's move on. And this is how they caught him, because when they went to go and speak to him, he was still wearing that shoe, the matching pair to the shoe that they had found at the crime scene. I'm not sure if he was wearing one shoe only or if he was wearing a mismatched pair of shoes, but that doesn't really matter. They found him wearing the matching pair to the one that they had found at the crime scene at Lubambo's house. Finally, on the 12th of August 2012, Mabhayi was arrested just a day after committing his final murder. And as it turns out, he wasn't even on the police's radar for these crimes. They didn't think him to be a prime suspect. They actually thought that his brother Siyabonga was responsible for these crimes. Thankfully, he didn't go on trial, because over a year later, on the 27th of August 2013, he pleaded guilty to 20 counts of murder, 8 counts of rape, and 10 of housebreaking with intent to rape. During his admission, he did apologize for his crimes. He apologized to the families for what he had put them through, and he said that he had learned from his experience and that he believed that he was still of value to society and to his community. And then he closed off by saying that if he had not been caught in 2012, he would have carried on killing because he has no regard for human life. The reason that he gave for doing all of these horrible things, for eventually killing these women, killing these families, was because all of his victims knew him. He had worked in their houses before. They knew him from the community. They knew him from the village that they all lived in together. So they all knew exactly who he was. They would have been able to identify him if he hadn't killed them. And the reason that he gave for murdering the children who were 14 months old and 15 months old, children that wouldn't have been able to identify him anyway, was that he was overcome by an evil spirit when he killed the children. National Prosecuting Authority Regional Spokesperson Luxolo Tjali said that they were glad that Mabhayi had pleaded guilty on all charges. And I'm going to quickly read you a quote from Tjali. They said, "This is an indication that we had a strong case against him. This will also save us time and state resources." I'm actually in disbelief. I am flabbergasted is the word. If state time and resources had been used correctly, like they had initially been allocated for in the task force, then maybe he would have been caught in May of 2010 after they ran the DNA samples and the DNA evidence that they had. Maybe 12 people wouldn't have died. So it's disgusting that they would say that it would be a waste of state time and resources to prosecute him, to go on trial, when they didn't even use state time and resources correctly in the first place. On the 3rd of September 2013, Mthatha High Court Judge Noluthando Konjwa sentenced him to 25 life terms and stated that he would have to serve a minimum of 25 years in prison before he was eligible for parole. When people think I'm exaggerating, in fact over-exaggerating, about the piss poor police work in South Africa, especially in poor black communities, I'm going to refer them to this video. I'm going to refer them to this case because it's a perfect example of just how shitty of a job they do. And when I compare this case to other cases like the Van Breda case or the Panayoti case, it makes me even angrier to think that just because these people were poor, just because the victims were poor, they were not deserving of good quality police work. Because in the Van Breda case, in the Panayoti case, so much effort was put into solving these crimes. So much effort was put into catching the perpetrators, following absolutely every single lead that they had. And granted that these weren't serial killer cases, but they were still murder cases, and it's just infuriating. I don't have words. I literally don't have words to describe how angry it makes me. Anyway, that is the end of the retelling part of this video. If that is all you came for, then this is the end of the video for you. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and give this video a thumbs up if you did enjoy it. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. If you are staying for the commentary, then that's what we're gonna do right now. All the articles that I read from, they'll be linked below, but I'm not gonna read like the full article. I'll just read bits and pieces of that article, so I'll link them below so that you can read the full article. So the first article, I haven't spoken about the detective that eventually caught Mabhayi, because personally I think that he's a bit of a narcissist, and this article from IOL will substantiate further. It was published on the 4th of September 2013. Captain Aaron Hanise and his team of detectives initially put up a 250,000 rand reward for an arrest leading to a conviction, but nobody came forward with any helpful information. You guys had set up a DNA collection center. You had DNA from the perpetrator and you didn't test it. So what do you mean that nobody came forward with any helpful information? What do you actually mean by that? What do you mean? We were looking for another person who happened to be Mabhayi's brother, the late Siyawanga. Incidentally, we got him because of the shoe we found on the crime scene. It matched the one he was wearing, said Hanise. The saliva that had been drawn from Mabhayi during Operation Good Hope, so that was the operation of them collecting all that DNA, the saliva that had been drawn from Mabhayi during Operation Good Hope proved indispensable. His DNA test results linked him to the string of murders. His DNA test results would have linked him to the string of murders before another 12 people died, if you had tested his DNA when you got his DNA, but because you didn't have his fingerprints, you thought that it was useless and you just put it to the side and you ignored it. It was a huge relief when he was arrested. I can gladly go on pension now, laughed Hanise. I'm really glad that the murder of 20 people is so funny to him. I'm glad that we can find humor in these dark times. I'm glad that he can finally go on pension. But he didn't even go on pension, he was fired. Got fired from his job. For something unrelated to this case, but it happened like at the same time as this case. And I actually find it very suspicious. It's very suspect what happened. Next up, we have a take from a pair of traditional healers. So Eastern Cape is a very culturally saturated, not culturally saturated, that's not the word I'm looking for, a very it's an area that's very deeply rooted in culture and custom, and I'm actually really glad that I found this from the two traditional healers, because I think it's really important, especially in the South African context, to link culture to crimes and to understand the different viewpoints of different cultures when such crimes are brought up. So I'm really glad that there's a cultural take on this, and it is from the September 3rd, 2013 edition of The New Age. Two traditional healers in the province say serial killer Bulelani Mabhayi suffered from a spiritual sickness called iqungu in his reign of terror, during which he killed 20 women and children in Tholeni village. Without condoning the horrific crimes that occurred between 2007 and 2012, the traditionalists said Mabhayi continued on his killing spree because he was not cleansed after the first murder. I personally believe that, like, people will have a different perspective on crimes based on the culture that they were raised in, and I don't think it's wrong that they are taking on a cultural viewpoint of his crimes. I don't think they're trying to excuse his crimes. I think they're just trying to explain how culture has an influence on your life and how culture can explain what is going on. Iqungu happens to a person who has killed another person and had not spiritually undergone the traditional cleansing ceremony afterwards. When a person kills another person in January, for example, he also kills in the same month the following year if he has not undergone a cleansing ceremony, and that is because of Iqungu, said Eastern Cape's prominent traditional affairs researcher Mpumelelo Maguliwe. According to Maguliwe, even if a person had killed another person mercilessly or in defense, iqungu will happen. The sickness, which had been known for years in Xhosa custom, reverses only when the family conducts a cleansing ceremony on the killer so that he does not repeat the deed. So again, I understand why they are linking culture to what he had done, because remember, he didn't have a family, so it would kind of makes sense that this iqungu had such a strong influence on him, because he never got the cleansing. But I don't think that he would have told his family that he was killing people so that he could have the cleansing in the first place. We don't know. We don't know, because he didn't grow up with his family anyway, so we don't know what his relationship with his family would have been like. If you don't get this cleansing ceremony, then the iqungu will follow you on and will persuade you to continue committing these crimes. I think it's a really interesting look at these crimes. I would be interested in doing more research on crimes that are deeply rooted in culture. I think it's something that would be interesting to look into, just as much as psychology. This is a science that is practiced and that is linked. You always want to know the psychology of a killer. I'm rambling. You always want to know the psychology of a killer. I think it's also equally as important to understand the cultural aspects. Western practices are equally as important, especially in my opinion, to African customs and cultures. And as a Black South African girl who grew up in a cultural environment, it's something that is important to me. It's something that I think is what I want to educate my viewers on. So if it's something that you're interested in, I'd be happy to do a video where I speak about more culturally related crimes, if that's something that you're interested in. But yeah, with all of that said, it does bring us to a close in this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you in my next video. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Let me know what you guys think of this case. Let me know what you think of the cultural aspects that I spoke about, the great police work that we have in South Africa, people leaving evidence in their offices instead of in evidence. I really want to know, do we not have evidence rooms in this country? I really want to know that. I need to know. Anyway, thanks again for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.